the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemist, to the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, we do want to mention briefly that we have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. Today, Taylor and I will be discussing Chapter 1 from Jeanne Schroeder's The Triumph of Venus, the Erotics of the Market. The first chapter is titled Pandora's Amphora, the Eroticism of Contract and Gift. It's nice because I think this reading really ties into the last couple that we've done. Gerard, Moses and Monotheism, even calls a little bit back to Adrian Johnston. And what was the title of that book? Infinite Greed.
I forget the subtitle.
What she kind of does is look at gift exchange and contract exchange, which you could say, I think the gift exchange, this would go back to Marcel Mauss, and the contract exchange, I think you might even say would perhaps be more clearly described as market exchange, but she's a former attorney. So that's kind of the perspective that she's going into, as far as that sort of like is the grounding for her perspective on the legal status of gifts in the current legal regime versus gift as it was practiced in terms of potlatch in these gift economies where there was no judicial system or, state, so to speak.
One of the things she says after practicing law, she kind of, after being a lawyer for 17 years, she goes and studies Hegel and Lacan. That's what I'm curious about, as what that origin story would be if we had her here with us today, asking her okay, so how'd you get into Hegel and Lacan? She does seem to turn to Zizek to work out her Hegel and Lacan stuff.
That's
so
true.
It could just be the fashionableness of Zizek
That's a good point.
It's beyond really important to know sort of why she turns to Hegel and Lacan. She turns to Hegel and Lacan to try to challenge different strands of legal theory. That seems to be her target for this chapter. We talked a little bit about this beforehand, but she's trying to sort of split the baby between the utilitarians on the one hand and the romantics on the other. And we'll talk a little bit about those positions, but I guess that's the brief outline of this chapter.
I think there is certainly a bias towards this liberal view of the gift that I think only arises, and to even use her kind of Hegelian logic, only arises when market exchange becomes the dominant form of exchange. That alters the way that gift has to be altered, yet gift still retains some of its, I don't know, what we say, archaic properties.
Yes.
Which is sort of germane to this too. We can get into that as well, because I do think that is interesting and goes back to Mauss and the gift and the spirits that inhabit the gift and the potlatch, etc., the kula and all that.
Yeah, one thing that I found interesting was this notion that if contract is both a primitive and imperfect form of eroticism, which is meant in a Hegelian, Lacanian sense, gift is even more sort of abstract, elementary, even more I don't even want to say a primitive form of eroticism, but almost she makes it out to be an incomplete form of eroticism.
Right,
And
right.
she'll say it's an autoeroticism. Again, this is to anticipate a little bit. So where we get to the gift as masturbatory, I guess the question would be contract as a primitive form of eroticism that would be mutual versus the gift, which is autoerotic, you know,
She straight up calls it masturbatory or even rape.
he links it to rape. So how do we get there is the question.
Yeah.
I guess we can back up and think about some of these terms, some of these the two teams. We talked about the utilitarians and the romantics. The utilitarians fail to radically distinguish contract and gift, but that's their fault. But on the other hand, what they are correct about is seeing if contract is based on self-interest in this abstract sense, they do not agree with the romantics who think that gift is some sort of altruistic type of exchange based on love or even, emotion, affect, etc. They see it as just as self-interested, right?
The flip side of that is that the romantics view the contract as this coldly logical process where love and all the affects that you just talked about that are assumed to be present by the romantic in the gift exchange, all that is removed. Like that's the two sides of the sort of dialectical or the dialectic for, at least for her, right? In her example.
Right. That the romantics are correct to not make gift just a form of contract or a lesser form of contract or an offshoot of contract, but they are wrong to think of it in this term as though gift is somehow better than contract. Right. Contracts are what alienate us, and gift is actually a way of overcoming that alienation and actually getting closer to that oneness, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And obviously that's where not only Hegel, but Lacan really shines when she brings up Lacan to demolish the romantics and suggests this notion that gift is closer to autoeroticism, masturbation, and by extension, a type of rape, because it is a kind of institutional violence. Now, in order to get there, we have to go through Mose. So we may want to go through Mose and revisit these two positions later and how Hegel and Lacan comes in. Does that sound fair? Or do you want to say anything maybe about Schroeder, or do you want to put any other points forward before we look at Mose?
I mean, while I'm thinking about it, I suppose I could just say that in the background, I think it's clear that maybe even, you might correct me on this, but if I'm not mistaken, wouldn't even maybe the romantic papers over the self-interest in the gift exchange versus contract or market exchange? I can't remember.
Yeah, I mean, the romantic is romanticizing. This is why she calls them that, even if they don't self-identify. Because I think the utilitarians might self-identify as utilitarian. At least the representatives that she cites, like Posner, there's Richard Posner and Eric Posner, their father and son. They are considering contract or even self-interest as the basis for wealth or utility maximization. Right?
Yes.
So the romantics kind of think, well, if contract is wealth maximization, there's something greedy about that, something self-interested in a dirty way. It's gift that is actually different from contract. And, as I said earlier, contract is for the romantics something that alienates us from others. But gift is something that brings people closer together, right? It's a very loose way of thinking about this language. But yes, you're right. Papers Over romanticizes the notion of gift. I don't think the people she cites, like Mary Radine, would self-identify as a romantic. I forget exactly what they call their position. But there is a sense in which she's using this catch-all term to say they romanticize a certain type of relationship between individuals that seems to view things in rose-colored glasses, whereas I think for her, from a Hegelian Lacanian perspective, it's really closer to the master bondsman, the master slave dialectic, right? That's kind of how she reads it. But again, this is just to anticipate. I guess we need to talk a little bit about Mose and his analysis of gifts. And one of her claims is that if you look at the utilitarians and the romantics, they both cherry pick from anthropologists and emphasize the details that align with their position and seem to ignore or neglect or misinterpret, if you want to be less sort of stringent about it. They, again, maybe even romanticize some of the anthropologists' findings in order to fit in with their respective arguments.
So where do you think is apt to start for Mose and the gift?
I guess we don't have to talk too much about it. We do have a whole episode on Mose and the gift. There's a few things before we get into some of the things we've discussed recently, even like potlatch and the other form of, and again, this is archaic, quote unquote, primitive societies that Mose is looking at, which even extends up to medieval Europe. So maybe not as, primitive as one might think. You don't have to necessarily agree with that terminology, but I guess there's potlatch, which is kind of gift giving as warfare, which we can discuss. And there's also a form of gift giving exchange in what is it? What's the islands called? The Trobiador. Do you remember the name of the islands that Mose looks at Malinowski's work and generalizes about a different kind of exchange, similar to potlatch, but not quite, called Kula, where you got these islands and island groups would sort of go clockwise in this sort of spree of giving. And what they're usually giving are these like sort of unusable objects. Even like the bracelets and necklaces that they're giving with the shells are like not necessarily meant to be worn, except in like the most ceremonial social gatherings. And they are giving these gifts in a way that, as we talked about with Mose, the gift given sort of burns a hole in your pocket when you get the gift. It's almost animated by these spirits that demand a gift, a counter gift. So I guess that's one of the things we can first talk about is that, and one of the things the romantics get wrong is that they think that gift giving is better than contract because it is more free. I give a gift because I want to, and it is, so to speak, no strings attached. But as we learn with Mose, that's incorrect in a number of senses. Gift giving and counter gift giving are not free acts. They are obligations. They are social obligations.
Because this is sort of the way that economy works, because you typically see this practice. I think she states that Mose is like, this is a specific universal stage of development for societies that are on this subsistence level of reproduction of the social. They produce most of their own food, shelter, etc., which I think also goes to why this closeness to production, like their intimacy with the productive process, the direct reproduction of the social system, makes the animation of the gift by the spirits of the dead far more powerful. Because I think, like I mentioned in the pre-show, some of this remnants of this archaic gift giving stuff still linger in the unconscious, because I was rehearsing to you that in a lot of situations I have preferred not. I don't want to exchange gifts with people, because then that means that don't buy me a gift, because then I have to reciprocate the gift. Like, it puts a certain unilateral burden on me to reciprocate the gift that you've given me, even though obviously I said that now that we're within market exchange, that sort of, it alters the way that gift functions, but it still retains certain archaic properties of this, whenever this more, I guess gift economy was the dominant form of mode of production.
Exactly. And I guess that's where the romantics are romanticizing, as we said, right? That first of all, giving a gift isn't in these cultures, but even today necessarily, although I think refusing gifts from acquaintances could be seen as a little bit less suspect, even
Right.
though there is still that affront one can commit by refusing gifts. But in these societies, one cannot refuse a gift, right? To refuse a gift is, again, like the master slave dialectic. One is refusing to stake one's life in the face off to the death or something like this,
Yeah.
right? One is showing oneself to be unworthy because in these societies, and this is where we kind of lean towards potlatch, but you can see it in Kula as well. You are giving the gift. One of the ways that this mechanism is the donee, the receiver of the gift, is not just getting these gifts, but also getting a little bit of something extra. This is the interesting notion of the etymology of gift as present and poison. You are also getting that, and as most describes it, this always stuck with me, and it could be related to magic, could be related to just even the magic of the social obligation one enters into. You are to return, you are to counter gift in a way that bears interest, to use that modern term, right? You have to give back plus, that you have to give extra. And one of the, I guess she was citing Malinowski or even most, where it was like expected in these types of exchange to be like 30 to 100% per year, right? So if you give me 2 bracelets next year, I've got to give you 4 or something like this, right? Doubled the ante if you think about it. If it's almost like a game of fucking poker to a certain extent. And this is where potlatch comes in, because potlatch takes this logic, including some elaborate rituals of destruction of sumptuary wealth and all this stuff, which is not the main point, but that's part of it. But yeah, potlatch is like a war of gift giving, where you
Right.
are almost trying to make your opponent tap out of their chips, their funds, their whatever it be, bracelets, blankets, depending on the culture we're talking about. I guess that's one of the things where this is partly how, if you want to streamline gift giving taken to its logical conclusion, there's one winner who has outgiven to the point where the receiver has to give basically all they have in order to even try to reciprocate or lose social standing, prestige, etc. There's a sense in which there is a, maybe not somebody who has all the things at the end, but at the end has vanquished their opponent and devastated them, whether it be through objects or if we consider prestige part of the social object, to the point where if you don't give back in kind and extra, then you not only lose prestige, you potentially are haunted by the fucking spirits of the dead, or you are subject to raids and theft, because it's only fair you didn't live up to your end of the bargain. And so I guess this is the straight line. If contract and gift are 2 forms of eroticism, which is basically the subtitle of this book, this question of the libidinal economy that we're discussing,
Yeah.
and how these types of economic relationships, but also juridical, political, etc., are erotic. If there is an eroticism to gift giving in this basic way that we've outlined, for her, it's unilateral. It's not mutual. It's like the master and the slave, because there's a unilaterality where the master vanquishes the one who will not go to the end and risk his life, because it's your servitude or your life, and the servant chooses life. But in the end, the twist of the dialectic, obviously, and I'm simplifying, of course, where the master is only raised to nobility by slaves. So even there, in the master slave relationship, there's not a mutual recognition. There is a hierarchy. There is a sense in which it goes one way. And that's why it's masturbatory or autoerotic gift giving. where the logic is unilateral. And you can even generalize today when you were talking about in refusing gifts, where you're refusing gifts because to a certain extent,
It throws a lot of ambiguity into the social relation between you, because it's like, if I don't give a gift that's equal in value, or when do I give it's almost like this aversion to creating this, going back to Girard, right? Like the reciprocal violence that has no like
has no
sustenance.
end.
And she even
Yeah.
gets into this by pointing out at the end, in the late or mid 18th or 19th century, when some of these potlatch practices were still going on. This is kind of funny, actually, because of the
They had to be
absurdity to it.
outlawed, right?
Yeah,
They had to
because
be
they were like bringing thousands of the scores of blankets and like
He
all
said
this other
scores of
bullshit.
her way of phrasing it is scores of thousands of blankets, right? Which is funny. And these blankets weren't even being used to like keep people warm,
Yeah,
right?
right. Yeah, they had no use value. It's
no use value
merely
at all.
pure symbolic value related to this debt creditor sort of relationship that exists even in the gift economy. That maybe is the basis for the way that it evolves into contract. You still have a war between creditors and debtors,
Yes.
and under contract exchange, but it's like there are two different methods of sublimating social violence in a certain sense, right? Because the sublimation of the violence in the gift exchange is trying to take perhaps the violence between clans or whomever is involved in the system of gift giving,
right,
who are bound under that, right? Like, this is a way of keeping violence attenuated only under, like, yeah, once it hits us, there is certainly the potential for violence to spill out if gift obligations are not met. But there at least is this sort of check, this regulatory check that tries to maintain a certain equilibrium within the society, the way that there are mechanisms within market or contract exchange. One being the mediation of the state, that the mediation of the state and their disinterested element helps to mediate the potential violence between parties if the contract is not met. I think there's even also something else going on with regard to this war between creditors and debtors. Again, that is sort of a sublimation to try to keep this social violence at a equilibrium to where things are not devolving into the war of all against all or something like that.
One thing that I thought a nice little footnote she had about these potlatch societies in the 19th century with, as she says, scores of thousands of blankets being traded, right? This enormous sum of non-used or even usable gifts. She's arguing against the romantics who are saying, look, the potlatch got disrupted because of commodity production of blankets, from the West. And she's like, no, that's not how it happened. If you look at the anthropologists, it was outlawed because the commodity production of the blankets would have actually accelerated and brought to its logical conclusion the continuation of potlatch. Not put an end to it as though the blankets were worth something because they were handmade and blah, blah, blah. No, that's not where their value came from, right? Their value didn't come from their value as being couturier designer blankets. In fact, and obviously we don't have data on this, but in fact, the logic of potlatch would have just continued and even been open up to a whole new venue of circulation of this war, of this gift by war. For her, that helps bolster her argument against the romantics who see, as she says, the problem with gifts isn't commodification, as the romantics claim. And she looks at Mary Redean in particular as being exemplary of this, where Mary Redean looks at homes, cars, and jewelry, which are like typical status symbols, which again, the romantic seems to like not quite want to articulate. I think her favorite analysis was of the ring, where look, the ring isn't valuable because it was handcrafted by the husband. That would be an interesting courtship ritual, by the way, right? If you had to take like blacksmithing or goldsmithing classes to like forge the perfect ring and study gemology and all this stuff. No, I mean it's made of gold, which is one of the most commodified substances. I mean, you just look at a random page in Capital and you can see that. No, it's the commodification of jewelry, and there's a whole fucking industry to it, right? Doesn't keep the wedding ring from becoming symbolically endowed. For her, looking at Hegel and Lacan and property, and of course, that's a whole discussion that I think we will have in the future. But commodification actually makes possible, it makes room for the symbolization, the symbolic libidinal investment in the ring rather than the converse.
Yeah.
And I guess she says it's not commodification, it's consumerism. Now, obviously, they are not unrelated, but they aren't synonymous. That's the interesting thing. And we have to be very, very careful here because she's not really doing a general critique of capitalism. She is very strictly kind of working within these juridical institutions.
Yeah, but she
modern,
doesn't
anarchic.
even she's not even getting into something like charity, which I think kind of gets into the could be drawn. You can certainly take the logical leap, and I may even go there with the idea that something else about the potlatch that I think, and she even says this, there's a greater, I think this is the big thing at play, is that there is a greater efficiency, there's a greater in aggregate wealth generation within market exchange, within contract exchange than gift. And it even, because
100%.
it even goes to the example of the amount of production time to produce all of these like fucking blankets. That's a lot of energy and time that is being generated only to
being
like,
sapped off from
without
commodity production, right?
Without any like real exchange, or not. There is exchange value, symbolic exchange value, but there is no actual use value tied to the production.
Right.
So,
it's a different kind of surplus value being generated. It's not surplus value in the sense in we think of in capitalist societies, not in the sense in which Marx describes wealth generating wealth or money generating money, really, right? Because we're not necessarily talking about money. It's not the $100 advance generates an extra 10 at the end of the circuit. And this is, I think, why we should go ahead and address this kind of boogeyman where she wants to say, as we'll talk about, contracts are mutual and enter into this kind of dialectic where we can get something closer to a primitive form of love, blah, 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 instead of masturbation and rape through gift. But I think that the thing that she overlooks, or maybe is not bringing in that historical Marxist view that Deleuze and Guattari do in Anti-Oedipus, is that their analysis of gift exchange, which has some interesting elements that Schroeder leaves out, which I won't bring in all of it. But one of the things that we could obviously see is that if potlatch is gift by warfare, and if we know in the primitive territorial machine, warfare is meant to sort of ward off any centralized accumulation of a power that would constitute states, wouldn't they see most in the gift? Now, obviously, they prefer genealogy of morals and Nietzsche, but that's, again, another story. Wouldn't they see this logic of potlatch, especially when it's destroying wealth, quote unquote, in order to accumulate surplus prestige, surplus value of code, really is what they would say. Is it not to ward off this nightmare that haunts all societies retroactively, capitalism, the formation of capitalism? Isn't that maybe the real reason why potlatch is outlawed in the 19th? Is that such a coincidence that it conflicts with the burgeoning and acceleration of capitalist development?
well, I mean, absolutely, because like I was saying, yeah, it's like all this productive energy and time is being wasted on this surplus production that doesn't have any exchange or use value.
Even saying wasted is slanting it
Right, yeah,
towards.
that is true. Yeah.
But go ahead. Sorry, I'm not
Well,
critiquing you. I'm just.
Well, I think in the aggregate, all right, because she says, okay, in the aggregate, it's not about, and again, this even goes back to like the last discussion about from what Gerard, it's not about the individuals, it's
Mhm.
about the aggregate. So
the collective
wealth
Mhm.
is higher whenever we don't waste, quote unquote, waste our productive capacity on this and things are generated for market exchange. Now, where this gets interesting would be to even dredge up our discussion with Adrian Johnston, where, you know, I think in that discussion, we talked about Elon Musk as bringing into question this notion of whether it is truly greed which drives the capitalist market economy, and calling into question, well, self-interest certainly is at play. Like we've sort of set up how that works, both in the gift and in the contract, because in the gift, I'm looking to increase, in the gift economy, I'm looking to increase my social prestige. In the market economy, I'm looking, in a sense, like you could say the end goal is almost the same. Like I'm kind of looking to increase my prestige, but maybe that would be fall into consumerism. I'm not super clear on how to disaggregate those two things. And it may ultimately come down to the development of alliance with regard to marriage, if that makes sense. So I think maybe that, as opposed to trying to assume that potlatch is about giving these useful items that have a use value, I think you might assume, like, that seems more of a logical, commonsensical understanding would be like, oh, okay, well, they're doing these exchanges of actual useful items. That kind of makes sense retroactively looking back from our modern mode of production. Are you following me?
I think so, except in potlatch, supposedly these gifts aren't being used because
Right. No. Yeah, that's what I'm saying is that
okay.
so the gift economy, because it refuses to, or like is a check, it's it's like a check or a break, a stopgap, or not a stopgap, but it's like this libidinal break on the accumulation of wealth. It keeps a certain equality as far as economic wealth, but then like conversely,
It's an inequality in social
correct.
relations. Yes. And I think that's where, since she isn't discussing capitalism and its origins or its downfall, we just had a little excursus. Yeah, that's where her problem with this romanticization of, this is where she takes issue with the romantics and seeing.
Now I still have to take this back to Elon Musk just to remember that.
Oh, sure. I mean, go ahead.
On the other side, in market exchange, the generation of wealth, in a sense, like in this macroscopic way, there's a perverse altruism to the accumulation of capital, in the sense that, again, the individual sort of is irrelevant, but the accumulation of wealth is a strategy to reproduce. I don't know. Is it a strategy for the unconscious to reproduce itself? Is there a machinic unconscious element and death drive associated with this accumulation that is an attempt to sort of perpetuate the continuation of either the species or the unconscious or something like that? I know that's getting a little bit, that's extrapolating quite a bit, but in this Hegelian way, right, there is a kind of altruism in the sense of generating wealth for the species as a way to somehow, this is a strategy to reproduce society or the species or the unconscious. I don't know. I'm not so, haven't nailed that down, but I think,
Well, it's a more abstract way of reproducing differences. In a perfect market, as she points out, in a perfect market, if a perfect market would be such that exchange halted, that would mean everyone had just as much as everyone else.
right, which would be communism, right?
That would be indifference. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I also think it would be like, I almost started to think of communism as a situation where wealth is immaterial, or like it's rendered, there's so much wealth that it negates itself. Once we accumulate a certain amount of wealth, it would negate the difference that is created by wealth and class, right?
Yeah, the question of the circulation of differences, i.e., objects or commodities, if you want to use that term, would find a certain equilibrium for the market to perfect itself. And that's obviously not a capitalist market.
It would be
right?
like Star Trek and the what do they call them? The fucking, the word escapes me, but the, how they get all their food, like they just generate that shit. Once everybody can generate their own anything they want at any time, then it kind of just makes class distinctions and productive distinctions irrelevant.
So I guess that's the question about.
I mean, that's kind of the accelerationist thesis, right? As we reach a we reach a state of production where these differences in terms of class just become mute, like the status one would accrue by generating becomes irrelevant.
And so I guess that would become the my buddy just said Biden dropped out.
Yeah, I saw that on the Times, New York Times.
Sorry, you
World
cut that.
historical moments. No, we might have to keep it in.
world fucking spirit, bro. We are shit. Not to dwell too much on this, but I think that we will come back to it where the capitalist market is not obviously, even if contract imperfectly reaches more of this mutual recognition that is desire of the other in the Hegelian and Lacanian sense. And that's why Schroeder tries to harp on the mutual recognition of contracts producing not only equality, it's the identity of identity and difference in the Hegelian terms, right? There's an identity and we agree on a contract, but there's a difference in which we are obviously entering into some sort of relationship whereby you're getting what you want, I get what I want, etc. Obviously, in the capitalist nature, and you said creditors and debtor and whatnot, there is an acceleration of massive differences to the point of ridiculousness. But I think we'll see in the later parts of the book more of this critique of the utilitarians. I know she brings up a couple of them and how they're wrong, but the utilitarians, the wealth maximizers, as they want to call themselves, she will spend more of the chapters looking at them in a critical lens with, these notions of Hegel and Lacan, specifically Lacan and these fantasies. But I did like that she was talking about the romantics as perverts or fetishists. I thought that was interesting. Because there's a way in which one treats the object as subject, right? So the mutual recognition of the romantic or the pervert idealized in gift exchange, it's kind of like commodity fetishism, right? Where things are standing in a certain relation and covering over the social relation.
Right.
It's the fetishist is fetishizing the object in the gift exchange and trying to go through the object and the dialectic that requires subjects. I think that's why abstractly, again, she is working very schematically and abstractly, not just at least in the philosophical domain, which is bringing up Hegel. It's in contract that there can be ideally a mutual recognition. And insofar as contracts are still imperfect, and insofar as those differences in the capitalist market are still require certain inequalities or sort of obligate certain inequalities in contract, that's just because, speaking of like this world spirit shit, the concrete actual essence of contract has not yet been realized. And I think that we took that detour through capitalism, communism, et cetera, in order to kind of maybe anticipate what she may bring out a little bit more in the book. But it's a glaring obviousness that capitalism will continue to perpetuate these imperfections, to use her term, in contract as mutual recognition. To a certain extent, you just go through the fact that for Deleuze and Guattari, capitalism is born out of the encounter between the conjugation of the flows of abstract labor and abstract money equivalents. So the majority of contracts are sort of done through labor power, which is an abstraction from my person. That is the wealth generating matrix. I will say she herself is working within the confines of quote unquote modern liberal abstract institutional categories. But I don't want to yet critique her for doing so. There's still more of us to uncover in the book. So it'd be easy at this point just to say, well, where's your critique of capitalism? And maybe it is not forthcoming, but I think that following her logic, we will see some of these types of categories become more complicated and more called into question, which, is the Hegelian move. Say, oh, look, I was building these contradictions into these different notions, and we're going to see how that moves the system along. So I guess she is setting up these contradictions, and I'm excited to kind of see how that plays out a little more.
One thing I wanted to bring up was either in conversation or just like listening to one of Todd McGowan. I think when they were covering Deleuze and Guattari, not to get in this like war of all against all with regard to like our waving banners for our favorite philosophers, but one thing that McGowan said was that he didn't see how Deleuze and Guattari, anything that they sort of gesture towards, would sort of contradict the logic of capitalism. And my rejoinder to that is there's nothing in market exchange. And I think Schroeder would perhaps even agree to this, would be there's nothing within market exchange. There's nothing within Hegel that would contradict market exchange. The only question is the one of recognition, the aspect of recognition. I'm not so, that we could perhaps discuss. Although I will say that there is some credence to this in the sense that with regard to property and the law being the structuring or generator of subjectivity. And there is like, as I don't know, to me, my instinct is I'm skeptical of this, but I will say that if we observe the conflict between Israel and Palestine, we sort of see in a way how the Palestinians are quote unquote stateless. The property that they supposedly have is being appropriated by Israel. And even though they might have like this kind of, even maybe not formally legal claim to the property, like this is where Stirner comes in, like I was talking earlier about with you about how private property being a legal fiction, and really it's about power. It's about power and occupancy in terms of property, and this idea of there being this legal control or like the legality of something determining who possesses or owns something is kind of like this, I don't know, a falsehood. That's being kind of quick and dirty, but
since we brought it up last time, and I brought up Deleuze in his essay on Stones, one of the things Deleuze says is there is a way in which Israel is showing the world a different form of colonialism, because traditional colonialism, you quote unquote occupy a territory and then sort of perform this you impose the servitude and extract this wealth from the peoples there, right? That's the traditional form of colonialism, which began with mercantilism and helped to spiral into capitalist extraction. That's the traditional form of colonialism. You impose a kind of sovereignty over a people against its will, and you use them to extract surplus value, right? Whether it be from the land or from the production, from servitude, slavery, etc. Right? That's the traditional model that the great European nations imposed. And what he's showing with Israel and Gaza is how there is also a way of colonizing that is, in effect, taking over the land and depopulating. So instead of putting the population to work, one depopulates a land. And it's that form that he kind of is signaling that Israel's been doing for decades, right? It's the super neo-colonialism by depopulation rather than population control or population indentured servitude, etc.
This is maybe the example where this lack of recognition tied to a state, etc., comes into play, and maybe why, like, clearly the whole world is witnessing what's happening here, and no one is taking action on behalf of, well, not no one, but
even wearing a Palestinian flag is an affront to the
so
Zionists, because it is as though the Palestinian flag, whether it be the state, just the symbol of just someone being Palestinian, is already a kind of dehumanized other that can't be in. It's the master slave dialectic again, right? There can't be a mutual recognition. And so there can't be a mutual recognition between states if, as you said, right, there is no Palestinian state that has the power and force of law to be recognized. And USA has a lot to do with that, supporting Israel as we always have, not just with bombs, which is another thing we do, right? But supporting them militarily, juridically, institutionally, morally, in alliance, etc., politically. There is a sense in which this type of failed mutuality, which is part of the goal, actually, that's part of the idealism, I think, of contract, is that the goal would be mutual recognition based on
Right.
equality, and you get something, I get something. But if the goal is actually the failure of mutual recognition, if that's the success, then yeah, one can then question what type of dehumanization, what type of depopulation, what type of deprival of rights. I think this is why Deleuze is actually close to Stirner here, the way you were describing it, because for Deleuze, this talk about universal human rights may sound good and make us feel good, but it doesn't mean shit unless it is enforceable and enforced. And this is why he brings up that notion of jurisprudence. For him, jurisprudence moves case by case and isn't this universal abstraction. Universal human rights still have to be enforced in a particular micropolitical situation. Otherwise, it's still empty talk and a quote unquote fiction, but just like property as a legal fiction, it has to have some sort of violence. And I mean that in the most general sense, some sort of force in order to.
If property requires force, so if property is by force, then it doesn't exist and property would belong to all. Kind of might have fucked up that formulation a little bit, but do you get kind of what I'm gesturing towards?
Sure, and I guess that there would have to be a kind of counter force on the other end.
It's like if
it doesn't devolve back into singular ownership.
True, right?
It would just be a different organization of forces.
If might makes right, if power is the only thing that holds in property relations, then I think this notion of private property as a natural right, so to speak, breaks down. Could also go to something like, the prohibition of incest. If something is desired, then it's prohibited. That formulation, do you see it kind of the equivalency?
Yeah,
I'm almost wrong.
The Freudian formulation.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there's maybe a relationship there. I don't know. I'm too amped up to for my brain to tie a bow on that, but
well, thou shalt not covet, right? Why is that a commandment? I mean, Freud would say because it's desired, because we all desire to covet by nature. And I think that the Hegelian framework that Schroeder's working with is to start with the abstract liberal individual of modern society and show that that's only containing potential freedom. That's the quote unquote natural state. And in order to actualize that freedom, we have to have these interrelationships, this collective, trans individual relation, which for a legal theorist is going to be much closer to contract in its mutuality. Now, the question of how contracts are radically different, let's say in a feudal society where they are probably restricted for a very few individuals, and modern societies where theoretically, at least, they are meant to apply to all citizens, which again leaves out a large number of individuals, if you think about it. Just thinking of like E-Verify and like the question of undocumented peoples, right? Like their ability to enter into contracts is very much restricted. So it is a question of citizenship, right? In that broad sense. And across different cultures and societies, the question of citizen has obviously radically changed. That's part and parcel of the matrix of this question of contract, is like what counts as the free individual that is endowed with the powers of citizenry. And this probably has a grain of truth in it. But, in the days of like the Roman Empire, there was a certain power in being a Roman citizen. there was this like aura of, again, taken with a grain of salt, there was this aura of, if you violate me as a Roman citizen, let's say, I mean, obviously other Romans, but I mean like out other people's, I can travel freely and be secure and rest in the notion that if you violate me as a Roman citizen, the power of the Roman state will come and fuck you up. And there's still a sense of that entitlement to being an American, right? With our military industrial complex, even if it's, again, mostly a type of fiction. But the question is, fictions do have force. That's part of I guess that's the corollary to Stirner's and Hegel's notion of property as a legal fiction. That doesn't necessarily mean fictions don't have effects in reality, just the same as fantasy in the Lacanian sense. To think that if we say mere fantasy, we're not speaking in a psychoanalytic register, because fantasies are extremely powerful, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Something else I was going to talk about was that, going back to my example of not wanting to exchange gifts with other like friends and stuff, when you really analyze that, the gift exchange is like a mediation, or like the exchange between people's means that in both contract and in gift, that exchange is a sublimation of violence. And if we don't exchange, if we're not exchanging, whether it be gift or contract, that opens up the potential for violence to arise.
Right. It's the refusal of alliance.
Now, where this, exactly, precisely, the refusal of alliance. So you could look at, in one manifestation, we can look at perhaps, and I've used this as an example before, it's only the people that we don't exchange with that are considered our enemies, or the axis of evil, North Korea, Iran, so there's something there. But then also, maybe to counter her claim, Schroeder's claim would be like the market itself. Yes, and this would go to recognition. So yeah, the market is kind of this universal thing, but it also acts as like, if you don't have the money to enter the market, then it's a barrier to exchange. It also has this negative element to it, right? Because the market, and then if you think about people that are not per se exchanging on the market, the unhoused population, there's no recognition between us and the unhoused population, because you try to ignore them, or you zone out. You can't almost give them a subjectivity, because it's a sort of threat to your own. If we're presuming that the existence of the state and contract exchange is what allows the subject to arise, then if you are not participating within those strictures, then again, you're unable to recognize, you're unable to exchange with the rest of society. And so you are shunned in a kind of weird way that harkens back to this more archaic mode of organizing the social. Because if you didn't fulfill your social roles within gift exchange, then, you were shunned or what have you. And these were like, you would probably die if you left. You couldn't simply move to a different land or country or what have you, because you would have to reproduce your entire existence, which you obviously can't do on your own.
Just look at Game of Thrones and the character of Walter Frey. Like, the Freys for generations have sort of been kept out of this social collective existence of forming alliances and being subjects in mutual recognition, right? They are sort of left isolated in the very middle of the fucking heartland, to the point where, as Walter Frey says, like, I had all these sons and daughters that I needed to get rid of, right? Which means to form these alliances. And, when Robb Stark, that's really the highest dishonor. It's not just the recognition of the Tullys and the Starks and whatnot, but the recognition of forming the alliance, of allowing that the phrase
to be recognized as it's like equal.
as a
It's
house,
almost
not
why
just
it's such
him as a
yeah,
person, but as a house, right?
collective.
They're being shunned, and so this is why the breaking of hospitality, one of the most inviolable sort of rules of social regulation, is the crime. And you could say maybe the crime is disproportionate, but to a certain extent, if you look at it from the point of view of the phrase, it's very logical. They are not the first to break these rules of mutual recognition, of social
Yeah.
and contract, right? There was a fucking contract, if you will,
For
being
sure. Yeah.
Rob Stark entered a contract,
He did.
and he did it out of loyalty to his father, but to a certain extent,
Utility is involved.
I
Absolutely.
mean, the utility is involved. So yeah, to a certain extent, we can despise the phrase, and of course, Walter Frey is a very despicable person. But on the other hand, he's very justified in what he does, and when he kills Rob Stark and Catelyn and a lot of the Stark host. I mean, there's a sense in which he not only feels justified, but thinks it's a proper requital, right? It is to a certain extent, and it's something that had built up over generations, right? The conversation with him and Catelyn when she first comes to sort of negotiate this is really very telling. I mean, like, it sets up the whole arc leading to the Red Wedding, the way that he's inquiring about her father and the Blackfish, her uncle, and how they haven't come to any of his wedding. He keeps marrying all these women, right? And they haven't come to any of his festivities. So he's like literally telling us how he's been isolated and shunned. He can only reproduce through filiation, right?
Yeah.
There is this kind of sterile filiation because so many of his children are bastards, which has more weight in Game of Thrones society than it does for us today. But if you look at our past, it's really not even that far back. Even that type of existence of bastards litters human history as well. This question of alliance, formalizing recognized, for example, even like property inheritance, right? Because to a certain extent, even the throne, the Iron Throne, the whole logic is through this question of filiation and inheritance and alliance.
100%.
All of this is being dramatized, and I guess that I was just trying to reinforce kind of what you were saying, or this question of isolate. I mean, to a certain extent, Frey is the kind of the beggar on the street that you were talking about, right? Is this like outside liminal figure, even though he's at the heart of the land, and it's that thing about again, back to what Schroeder said about property being being a wall, but also a bridge. To a certain extent, the literal bridge that Rob gets is a bridge because it's a wall, because he cannot cross.
Right. Yes.
He doesn't have the right of way that we talked about, right?
Excellent. Excellent.
He doesn't have the right of way. And that question of imposing the right of passing through his land maybe is what isolates him, because everybody doesn't want to deal with the phrase because they know the price to pay
it's high, right?
Very high.
Well, yeah. So this is where it goes to. I've been tweeting this shit the last couple of weeks. I've been kind of obsessed with this play on the law of supply and demand. That what it really means, and this would even go to maybe the sterner view of property, is that those with the supply make the demand.
And Frey has the supply.
He's got the crossing. If you want to cross, you got to pay his tax. And so
it's a very steep tax.
It's right. So how I draw that out is like, okay, well, sure, there's a certain a quote unquote mutual recognition present, but at the end of the day, in market exchange, like we discussed with Eugene Holland and the perverse markets, the market has a slant, and the market has a slant towards supply.
He has a supply of bastards, right?
If I'm your drug dealer, for example, if I've got the supply of drugs and you want the drugs, there's not an equilibrium really in play with regard to that. The
choke point, right, that you're talking about of the supply, right? Since he is the choke point, he's the bottleneck.
Yeah, and so I mean, it almost goes to that notion of how once wealth or productive capacity, once everyone can produce everything they need on their own, then wealth sort of negates itself, like it sublates its own utility.
It all depends, right? I mean, like even when we looked at go back to Cluster, we look at the hunter who is not supposed to eat his own kill, and that exclusive disjunctive relation. You got to think that, when you're talking about communism, it wouldn't necessarily be a reversion to a type of subsistence economy, because there's no turning back the clock to a certain extent, right? But, one could say the collectivization of farms was a move in that step. That's not the only step one has to take, but that's a move towards, if you will, a collective subsistence rather than an individual one. That's the thing, I mean, it's a question of what kind of bridges we want to build and the price we have to pay for them, I guess. That's
right. Oh, that's,
that is the thing in gifts. And that's, I think, why no one wanted to come to his receptions, because not that they were worried about a red wedding situation, but just that they might have to then invite him.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yes.
So what kind of person is he that one doesn't want to enter into this kind of, and obviously you were talking about not wanting gifts from friends, but it's interesting, right? Because like I come to visit you and you give me hospitality, and the way in which our friendship works obviously is that there's no negotiated like, okay, now Taylor has to do this, that, or the other. It's just a part of our conviviality. And so there can be those aspects where one can suppose gift exchange could fall into relations of hospitality. There are alliance building without going towards potlatch. But I think that in general, the rule holds. And, obviously my way of giving back is just being a friend, right? It's kind of like I have some friends where I will text them and may not hear back from them for a week. And it almost makes you start to worry. Or like, gosh, I just remember when I used to be in like, one of my friends asked me to like play a game with them once, and I started playing, and we played a couple of times that week. And then like the next week I see he's like online and he's playing with some other people in the group, but like, you're not invited. And so like I have to invite myself each time, to the point where I fall out of enjoying that.
Yeah,
There's
you
a
take
sense
the
in which
Walder Frey position there.
it's also like, it's kind of nice to be invited. It's kind of nice to have that,
To have mutual recognition.
to have fucking mutual recognition, right? And not to feel like, because then I get anxious sometimes, and it's like, man, fuck, do they really want me around? And of course they do. They are my friends, but that's part and parcel of it, right? Where we show these relations of hospitality, and really gift giving is that kind of just feeling included. That could be very simple, and I think it goes beyond gift giving at this point, right? I think that's where it's maybe a little bit more complex, and I hope we can read some Hegel and some Stirner, and I promise the listeners that we'll come back to Deleuze at some point. We're taking a break from Deleuze. We're gonna spend some time in enemy territory.
Here's how we could maybe at least tease the confluence here would be like, do you recall what the points that Eugene Holland made about contract with regard to sadists and masochists? Isn't there some type of...
Okay, so for Deleuze, one of the problems and Freud isn't immune from this critique, but one of his critiques of psychoanalysis, and then more generally as it gets applied, is for him, the terming of sadomasochism. He wants to say, no, sadism and masochism are two actually radically distinct formations. And so mixing them together is a way of sort of ruining the distinction. And one of the things, just to be very quick, because sadism has its own genesis and its own implications. And actually, Jean Laplanche traces this back to early childhood and is very good. And that's its own thing. And that follows the Freudian line. But for Deleuze, at least, masochism proper is based on contract in the sense in which we've laid out. And it's one in which the terms are negotiated delicately. And there is a sense in which, and we think about this now with like safe words, there's a way in which there can be a breaching of contract, right? In the masochistic relationship, there is a way in which one can overstep certain boundaries, and the safe word is there, at least ideally, for preventing that violation. And obviously, if you are not mutually recognizing the subs usage and imposition of contract violation, then you're doing something else. Now you're no longer in masochism. You're in a different territory.
That's where rape and autoeroticism would be involved, I
Well,
suppose.
yeah. I mean, that's potentially where you're giving something that the donee didn't ask for. Now we are
Now you're putting you're unilaterally what she says with regard to gift. So that's very much aligned with that whole critique. Interesting.
Yeah, now you're outside of the bounds of contract. And again, this is very loose, and Deleuze explicates this obviously more brilliantly than I laid out. But for him, sadism is not about contract. And so what that other thing is may look closer to this, what you just said about gift giving in its most pernicious form, right?
Yeah, where I turn you into an object rather than I objectify you by giving you the sort of gift. I guess
I give you the gift that can't be returned.
Ah, right. Yeah, the terrorist logic.
This is where we start to even get on, Baudrillard's symbolic exchange and death question, where I'm giving you such a gift that you can never return it in the increments allowed. So I think that the trajectory we could follow, and we may have a guest next week, James Wakefield, but I think the trajectory we could follow in August would be Hegel's philosophy of right, and then start on the unique and its property. And then from there, once we start getting into the fall, we can think about what we want to do. Maybe go back to, maybe by then we might feel like doing some more Deleuze, maybe even do Coldness and Cruelty. I mean, that's, if you read it with Venus and Furs, it's 200 pages. But I mean, if you look at the translation in English, it's like maybe 80, 90, something like that. We could probably do it in one sitting. I think that's the trajectory. Sound good?
Yeah. Something that we didn't talk about that I just want to, before we wrap up, fully want to bring into play is like, along with the gift economy, there's collective investment in the organs with regard to, is it filiation? We do have the prohibition of incest, right?
If you remember, it's the collective disinvestment of the organs.
I thought that would be market exchange.
That's where we start to get into extended filiation. And again, we might want to even revisit anti-oedipus for this, but it's the privatization of the organs, right?
Right.
Is it's one thing, but
which that goes to this thesis of subjectification, like being generated by the law and contract.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
The reason I bring this up is the market exchange is like that. There's an eroticism to market exchange, and the codes are defloated with regard to filiation or something like that. And what
the flows are decoded. You said the codes. You said the codes are defloated, which I love. That's a nice turn of phrase.
You have people like Jordan Peterson who are trying to say that femininity is this chaotic threat to the masculine law order. And it's because rather than whenever we had collective investment in the sexual organs and alliance, like there's a strict hierarchy, the codes are very clear and definitive in terms of the individual, where they fall within the general hierarchy. Well, in market exchange and in romantic love versus, you will marry patriarchy deciding the men get together and exchange women, right, under these economies, versus our modern economy where that restriction on women and marriage and reproduction that flow is decoded. That decoding threatens the whole, this is just to point out that Jordan Peterson is kind of a weirdly postmodern in his own thinking, trying to go back to this thing where all the codes are clearly defined, etc. I think you brilliantly this week, when we were talking about this, said coding better isn't the solution. There's no coding system it just can't happen for whatever reason.
Since you brought this up, it does go back to the Frey example, because what does Catelyn Stark say about Ned? They first she was in a kind of contract, and she wasn't freely entering it. She was there was arranged marriage between herself and Ned's brother. Ned's
Right.
brother dies. That carries over to Ned. They were an arranged marriage. This is the most traditional form of marriage that we can think of. And that arranged marriage, she said, it wasn't based on love. We built it brick by brick or stone by stone, something like that. And then she has to go and arrange a marriage for Rob. Now, what does Rob do? Rob is actually starting to turn towards what the new world might look like.
Right. Yeah.
Later, but
Well,
also
in the
he's-
show specifically, though.
But yeah, in the show. So a total exception of building a marriage based on love. And when Nietzsche says it very clearly in the Twilight Idols that when marriage is no longer this institution based on arrangement, but based on love, it no longer serves the same institutional functions, which is forming of alliance. Now it's something completely different. The institution has radically changed. And so he was resisting that traditional form of alliance building, which we see where that goes to someone who is desperate for alliances and mutual recognition. But in any case, that type of marriage, maybe it was more, you just wonder in the world of Game of Thrones, what type of marriages are based on love and not on some sort of arrangement of families.
Yeah, exactly. Based on just merely like the diplomatic element of it.
So I think
and
that's
tying the blood, like the blood ties. What's kind of interesting though in the book is that because it even goes to this in the sense that what Rob, he's injured in a battle, and the girl that he ends up marrying, he's kind of on milk of the poppy, and he's fucked up, and like they end up having sex in order to be honorable and not to despoil this girl, because if he had sex with her and it was known, then she would.
So it's a different logic in the book, is what you're saying.
It would be, yeah, but it would
it's
also
a totally different logic.
But it also means that her, like Jane Westerling is the girl's name in the books. It means that she would be attainted and would be difficult to exchange in marriage with another family.
So he's doing some Ned Stark shit.
Exactly.
With being honorable and trying not
precisely
to ruin,
yeah. So instead of being risking this bastardy or what have you, he decides to marry her, and therefore because he doesn't want to despoil her dishonor her. And so by doing, he dishonors this other arrangement, this contract. In the show, it does conflate the modern notion of marrying for love versus obligation. Right. But in the book, it's both, like it's this double bind of obligation on Robb Stark.
Yeah. Okay.
That constrains his movement.
That is interesting. It has its own implications. But, this goes back to her first book, The Vestal and the Fasces, where Schroeder analyzes how virginity is like the fetish object par excellence for patriarchy and for the masculine position.
We see this continue to today, right?
Oh, of course. And specifically women's virginity. The virgin, yes, there are incels, virgins on the masculine side, but that's almost the flip side of the fetish, right?
Yes,
that's all
100%.
Speaking of double binds, that's the interesting logic, right? Where virginity is supposedly this holy thing for women, but this curse for men. That kind of logic is unsustainable, right? I think that we can talk about more of these issues, though, next time. Or if not next time, then following up with the philosophy of right.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. The other like pop culture example I was going to give was from like Snatch. I don't know if you remember this, but they somehow get involved with Bricktop, and Bricktop is like, you guys are going to do me a favor. And Turkish says, oh, what he really means is we're going to do him a favor, because they want him to, because Bricktop says, okay, I'm going to do you a favor and let your fight in one of my fights, but he's going to take a dive. So you're really doing me a favor. So Bricktop is treating Turkish as an object to be exploited
Right.
in this unilateral fashion.
He's treating them as a means. That's another language.
Yeah,
the
that's true.
Kantian, Hegelian.
Good idea.
Like,
yeah.
He's treating them as a means to an end, which is the same thing, but that's part of the same language, right? Not an end unto himself, but a means to an end. Yeah. But that's the same language of gift giving, right? Is that in my giving the gift, you are a means to the end of increasing my prestige, etc. And now, again, there are exceptions to this. And we said, too, I think before the show, that in familial context and in the context of good friends, I think that gifts to a certain extent it all depends, right? It's all, one can imagine relations where those kind of scores aren't always tallied. Those are not typical.
And that's the specific, right? Because the market contract exchange is like the universal equilibrium, or at least part of it is.
Right. I guess that's what I was getting at to you with the footnote about that she had. Schroeder was like, well, listen, there is this way in which we may think more about gift giving in archaic societies. There's a specific there's a specific concept for it called prestation, where the giving of gifts is already bound up in the social obligatory way in which you can't refuse the gift and you have to counter gift. And that leads in the extreme forms to potlatch. So prestation as a way of giving in order to acquire prestige and all of this, instead of this more liberal notion of freely giving gifts. There's no freedom in the system of prestation. That's already a kind of socially obligatory relation of exchange. That would be the specific and the universal, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
I can choose to give you a gift because you're my buddy. And the gift could be like a Dune character, action figure.
Funko Pop or something.
Yeah. Like that kind of thing. It's different than prestation, which is really what we were talking about with most in gift giving in archaic societies. And so, and sometimes there, and even when you were like, hey, I've felt anxious about people giving me gifts because it harkens back to something maybe more akin to prestation, where you do feel now you are a little bit obliged. Someone has a little bit of power over you, something like that.
When I go on vacation, I've got to buy a gift for my roommate, or there's going to be an disequilibrium. You bought me a Christmas present this year, so that means next year I've got to buy you another. And then it just continues this mimetic cycle of exchange or what.
Right. It's a little bit different than...
But yeah, there is a certain distinction. I think you're sharp to bring that out. Yeah.
All right, but this is a lot of fun. I like the energy we're bringing to these conversations.
Yeah, I'm having so much fun lately. Like, this is super exciting. I just having a fucking ball doing this shit.
Yeah, man. I mean, I like the little course we've been traveling.
That will wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is outcast, to the whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.